All right, let's jump right in. Today we're doing a deep dive into something that's been sparking a lot of debate, woke, and how it connects to left-wing politics. You sent over this Dutch podcast, and I gotta say, it was really refreshing. Instead of the usual, you're either with us or against us kind of shouting match, these were two guests who both identify as leftists, really trying to figure out where they stand on this whole woke thing and what it all means.
You hit the nail on the head with that refreshing comment. It was really interesting how they dug into the way these terms have changed over time. Like, they didn't just go with the simple woke equals good, anti-woke equals bad kind of thinking. They acknowledged that the meanings of both woke and even left have become a lot more complex over the years.
That's what really caught my attention, too. So how do they actually define these terms? Especially woke, it seems like everyone's using that word these days. But what does it really mean, according to them?
Yeah, they described woke as basically being all about identity politics, placing a super strong emphasis on personal experience, what they called lived experience, and often even putting that lived experience above objective truth or scientific data.
Interesting. I could already see where that could lead to some clashes,
Yeah.
especially with how I've always thought about leftist thought as being very much about following the evidence, trusting science. Did they give any specific examples of this tension in the podcast?
Oh, yeah. They brought up Gloria Wekker. She's a pretty prominent Dutch scholar, and she's actually made statements that essentially dismiss the idea of objectivity altogether. It's a pretty bold stance, and they used it to show how this whole woke thing goes way beyond just being politically correct.
Wow, rejecting objectivity. Yeah, I can see how that would ruffle some feathers, even among people who consider themselves pretty progressive. It sounds like there's a real struggle happening here between this newer woke ideology and the more traditional leftist values that were rooted in things like the Enlightenment and valuing rational discourse. But I'm curious, how did woke become such a dominant force in the first place? Where did it all begin?
They actually traced it all the way back to the U.S. Civil Rights Movement in the 1960s. Back then, woke was mainly used as a call to recognize and fight racial injustice, really focused on raising awareness. It was like a wake-up call to society.
Okay, so the original intent was about opening people's eyes to injustice, which seems pretty different from how it's often used now. When did that shift happen?
Well, they pointed to events like the rise of Black Lives Matter. And look, Black Lives Matter is incredibly important. No one's debating that. But they argued that it also pushed woke into the mainstream. And as it did, it became more dogmatic, more prescriptive, less about opening up a discussion and more about saying, this is the correct way to think.
That makes a lot of sense. And the internet and social media probably played a huge role in that shift too, wouldn't you say? Like amplifying both the woke perspective and the backlash against it at the same time.
Absolutely. It creates this echo chamber effect where each side just digs in deeper, and it becomes way harder to have those nuanced, open-minded conversations that were more common before. And the guests on this podcast were really concerned about that, about this shift away from open debate. They felt like it was pushing people to these extremes and preventing any kind of middle ground from even existing. In fact, they used a real-world example to illustrate this. They talked about a painting that was actually removed from Leiden University.
Wait, seriously, what was the painting of?
It was a pretty harmless depiction of some men smoking cigars, but someone deemed it offensive and the university decided to take it down.
Hold on, offensive. Cigars. What was the reasoning there?
Well, the podcast guests saw it as a symptom of a bigger problem they're observing, a culture where everyone's overly sensitive, and there's this real tendency to just shut down any voices that don't agree with you. Even something as simple as a painting can become a target if it doesn't fit into a very specific worldview. And we've seen this kind of thing play out in much bigger ways, more publicly.
Right, like with J.K. Rowling, for example. She expressed views that some labeled as transphobic, and the backlash was intense. She was basically shut out of so many conversations, even though she was once loved by millions.
Exactly. They use that example to show that this isn't just about obscure paintings or some niche internet debates. This whole trend of shutting down anything considered offensive is having real consequences for everyone, from famous people to just everyday interactions.
So it's not just theoretical, it's actually impacting how people connect with each other, even in their personal lives.
Absolutely, and that's where things get really interesting because the podcast went beyond these high-profile cases and started looking at how woke ideology is showing up in everyday life, in relationships, and even in the dating scene.
Okay, man, that's something I really want to hear more about. How are they making that connection to everyday life? What kind of examples did they use?
Well, one example they talked about was the dating scene. They argued that men are becoming more and more hesitant to make advances, even in situations that would have been considered totally normal in the past. They attribute this to the shifting social norms we were talking about and this increased fear of being accused of misconduct.
Wow, so even dating is being impacted by all of this. It sounds like everyone's on edge, constantly worried about saying or doing the wrong thing and facing some kind of backlash.
And that's the key question they raised. Are we so focused on preventing bad behavior that we're actually stifling healthy interactions? Preventing genuine connection. It's a really complex issue. There's no easy answer.
Absolutely. So how does this all play out in the actual political landscape? What specific concerns did they raise about woke and how it's impacting Dutch politics?
Well, they actually named specific political parties in the Netherlands, like DENK and GroenLinks, which they saw as closely aligned with woke ideology, and then they contrasted those with parties like the SP, which has always been considered left-leaning but seems less comfortable with some aspects of woke thought.
That's fascinating. I mean, you'd think a party that's all about challenging the status quo would be fully on board with a movement that seems, at least on the surface, to be about pushing for social justice and being progressive. Why would they hesitate?
They suggested it might come down to political strategy and honestly, maybe even a bit of self-preservation. It seems like speaking out against even the most extreme elements of woke ideology can be really risky, politically speaking. You risk being labeled as insensitive or out of touch, which is basically a death sentence in today's political climate.
So there's this unspoken pressure to conform, even within a political party, that prides itself on being progressive and challenging norms. It makes you wonder how much genuine debate is actually happening behind closed doors.
Yeah, and that feeling of having to censor yourself goes beyond just politics. The guests in the podcast actually shared some really personal stories about how this pressure to conform is affecting their own lives and relationships.
Oh, I totally get that. Just the other day, I was at a social gathering, and I felt like I couldn't really express myself fully. I was so worried about saying something that would start an argument or get me labeled as problematic. It was exhausting.
One of the guests described a similar experience. They were talking about how they feel like they can't really connect with friends who have adopted these very rigid, woke viewpoints. They felt like anytime they express a different opinion, even a slight nuance, they're met with accusations and judgment.
So it's like this ideology, while aiming to create a more inclusive world, is actually creating new divisions and making it harder to communicate.
It's a real paradox, isn't it? And that's what makes this whole topic so challenging and so fascinating.
Okay, we've covered a lot of ground already. We've talked about how the meaning of woke has changed over time, how it's impacting everything from universities to personal relationships, and even how it's influencing Dutch politics. But there's something else they talked about that I found really interesting: the language of woke. Can you tell me more about that?
Sure. One thing they noticed was that people who identify as woke tend to use a lot of English terms and phrases, even when they're speaking in non-English speaking countries like the Netherlands. And they pointed out how this can create a sense of exclusivity, almost like a secret code that only the in-group understands.
You know, that's a really interesting point. Makes me wonder if it's intentional, like a way to establish a sense of belonging within the woke community, or even a way of asserting authority like, I'm in the know, I understand these complex concepts, and you clearly don't.
It's definitely a fascinating dynamic how language can be used like that to signal who belongs and who doesn't, and even create a kind of hierarchy. What stood out to you about their observation?
It reminded me of how sometimes, even without realizing it, we use language to create an in-group and an out-group. You know, it's like we're speaking different languages, even when we're technically using the same words.
And that makes it so much harder to have those productive, open-minded conversations that are crucial for understanding each other and finding some common ground.
Absolutely. It's a powerful reminder that even subtle things, like the words we choose, can have a huge impact on communication and relationships. This one Dutch podcast has already given us so much to think about. I'm really curious to see where else this deep dive takes us.
There is this one part in the podcast that really made me stop and think. They drew a parallel between what's going on with woke now and, believe it or not, historical examples of ideological extremism. Specifically, they brought up Maoism.
Oh, wow, that's not a comparison you hear every day. It seems like kind of a jump, you know? To connect something like woke to a historical movement with such a complex and, let's be honest, often brutal legacy. What were they trying to get at with that?
They weren't saying that the two are exactly the same, of course, but they were arguing that there are these really important lessons we can learn from history, especially when it comes to how ideological extremism, even when it starts with good intentions, can end up having unintended and often really harmful consequences.
Okay, I'm starting to see their point. So they're suggesting that even woke ideology, if it's taken to an extreme, could potentially lead down a similar path. But what made them choose Maoism specifically? What kind of warning signs are they seeing?
Well, they talked about how Maoism, even though it initially aimed to liberate the peasantry and create a more equal society, ultimately led to a period of intense social upheaval, violence, and the suppression of anyone who disagreed. And they see some parallels in how certain aspects of woke ideology, if taken to their extremes, could potentially create a similar situation where dissenting voices are silenced and there's this atmosphere of fear and conformity.
So it's not so much about the specifics of the ideology itself, but more about the potential dangers of any ideology becoming too rigid, too intolerant of opposing viewpoints, where it becomes less about dialogue and more about enforcing a strict set of beliefs.
Exactly. They were emphasizing how important it is to remember that just because something starts with good intentions, that doesn't guarantee a positive outcome. We have to be willing to critically examine our own beliefs and be open to the possibility that we might be wrong, even when it's about something we feel really passionate about.
Yeah, it's like that saying, the road to hell is paved with good intentions.
Yeah.
But how do we prevent that? How do we make sure that movements for social justice don't go too far and end up doing more harm than good?
That's a tough question, and the podcast doesn't claim to have all the answers. But they did stress how important it is to engage in critical thinking, even when it comes to ideas or movements we support. We can't just blindly accept everything we hear.
It's about being willing to ask those tough questions, to challenge the status quo, even when it's uncomfortable, and to be open to the possibility that we might need to change our minds or adjust our approach as we learn more.
Exactly. They talked about how we need to move beyond this us versus them mentality and recognize that we're all connected, we're all human. Because if we don't, we risk creating even deeper divisions and making it impossible to actually solve the complex problems we face.
It's about recognizing that most issues are multifaceted, that there's nuance and complexity, and things are rarely black and white. It's easy to get caught up in the emotions of these debates, especially online, but it's so important to step back and really think critically about the arguments being made.
It's interesting that you mentioned the emotional aspect because the podcast also talked about the potential downsides of always prioritizing lived experience above everything else. And I think this connects to what we were just saying about avoiding black and white thinking.
Right, they mentioned that earlier. Can you remind me why they see this focus on lived experience as potentially problematic? I understand that personal experiences are important and should be heard, but where's the danger in that?
They argued that while personal experiences are valuable, and they definitely offer unique insights, they shouldn't be the only thing we base our understanding of complex social and political issues on. They used a really interesting analogy to explain this. They talked about science.
A science analogy. Tell me more.
They pointed out that if we only based scientific discoveries on personal experiences rather than actual testing and data, we probably wouldn't have made much progress at all. Like, imagine if the laws of physics were based on how each individual experiences gravity instead of through observation and experimentation.
That would be total chaos.
Yeah.
Everyone would have their own version of reality, and there would be no way to know what's actually true.
Exactly. And that's the point they were making. Personal experiences are important, but they can be subjective and influenced by our own biases, emotions, and limited perspectives. To really understand the world, we need to combine lived experience with objective evidence, critical thinking, and a willingness to consider different viewpoints.
It's like that saying, if you're the smartest person in the room, you're in the wrong room. Being around people with diverse perspectives, even perspectives that challenge your own, is essential for learning and getting closer to the truth.
It's about having intellectual humility, recognizing that none of us have all the answers, and being open to learning from each other. And this is especially important when we're talking about complex issues that affect everyone.
So it's not about dismissing or minimizing the experiences of individuals, but understanding that those experiences, while valuable, are just one piece of a much larger puzzle. We need to look at the big picture, consider historical context, analyze data, and have real debates to come up with solutions that are truly just and equitable.
I think that's a fantastic takeaway. It's about finding that balance between acknowledging individual experiences of injustice and addressing the systemic issues that create those inequalities in the first place. And that requires a willingness to have difficult conversations, even when they challenge our own beliefs and assumptions.
This whole deep dive has really highlighted how important it is to approach these conversations with nuance and curiosity, instead of falling into the trap of simplistic solutions or black and white thinking. So what else did they say about how woke ideology is playing out in Dutch politics specifically?
Well, they specifically talked about the difference between parties like Deng and GroenLinks, which they associate with woke perspectives, and the SP, which is a traditionally left-wing party that seems a bit more hesitant to embrace those viewpoints.
I'm curious about the SP. Why would a party that's known for challenging the status quo be less enthusiastic about aligning themselves with a movement that seems, at least on the surface, to be about pushing for social justice and progressive values?
They suggested that it might be a strategic move. They pointed out that aligning too closely with certain aspects of woke ideology could actually alienate some of their traditional voters and open them up to criticism from both the left and the right. It seems like the SP is trying to walk this fine line between maintaining their progressive image and appealing to a broader group of voters who might not be on board with the more radical parts of woke thinking.
So they're in a tough spot. They want to be seen as champions of social justice, but they also don't want to alienate voters who might think some of these woke ideas are going too far.
Exactly. And this isn't just happening in the Netherlands. We see the same tension playing out in left-leaning parties all around the world. How do you balance your core values and commitment to social justice with the realities of politics and the need to appeal to a diverse group of voters?
Yeah, that's a question with no easy answers. But it's definitely one that we, as engaged citizens and deep divers, need to be thinking about. It's about understanding the nuances of these debates, considering different perspectives, and being willing to have thoughtful discussions, even when they're challenging. It's about recognizing that progress is rarely simple or straightforward, and it requires ongoing effort, critical reflection, and a willingness to change our approach as we learn and grow.
I couldn't have said it better myself. And you know what's really amazing? All of these big political questions came out of a single podcast episode, from the personal thoughts of just two people wrestling with a complex ideology. It really shows how powerful individual voices can be in starting bigger conversations and challenging the way we think about the world.
This whole deep dive has been a reminder that even within groups that seem really similar, like those on the political left, there could be a huge range of opinions and experiences. And it's often those dissenting voices, those who are willing to question and challenge the accepted narratives, that lead to the most meaningful conversations and real progress.
It's a call to embrace nuance, to question assumptions, and to have those difficult conversations with empathy and a real desire to understand, because ultimately, that's how we move forward together toward a more just and equitable world.
And this podcast was full of these little personal stories and observations that really bring these abstract ideas down to earth. I'm excited to hear more about those personal experiences they shared, those moments where they had to deal with the complexities of woke in their own lives. I think those stories will give us an even deeper understanding of how this ideology is impacting people in relationships. I'm really eager to hear more about those personal stories, those moments where they had to actually navigate the complexities of woke in their own lives. It feels like those stories could give us a much deeper understanding of the impact this ideology is having on people and relationships.
Yeah, one of the stories that really struck me was about one of the guests who was describing how they felt increasingly isolated from some of their friends. These were friends who had adopted these very rigid, almost dogmatic, woke viewpoints. And it was like any opinion that differed even slightly from the accepted narrative was met with immediate judgment and accusations. It really painted this picture of friendships becoming strained, conversations feeling like minefields.
Yeah, that feeling of walking on eggshells, always worried about saying the wrong thing, I think that resonates with a lot of people these days, especially in certain social circles where it feels like you can't express yourself authentically or even ask questions without the fear of being labeled as problematic.
Exactly, and that's the really sad part, isn't it? That this ideology, which on the surface is all about promoting inclusivity and social justice, can actually end up creating new forms of exclusion and division. When people are afraid to speak their minds or challenge ideas because they're worried about the social consequences, we lose that ability to have those open and honest conversations that are so crucial for growth and understanding and progress.
It makes you wonder, are we really creating a more just and equitable world if we're silencing dissent, even within our own ideological circles? Is it really progress if it comes at the cost of open dialogue and the free exchange of ideas?
Yeah, those are some of the big questions this podcast brings up, and I think they're questions we all need to be thinking about. It's not about having all the answers or picking sides, but about recognizing how complex these issues really are and being willing to engage in those tough conversations, even when they're uncomfortable.
And speaking of those personal experiences, they also talked about something we touched on earlier, that observation about how people who identify as woke
Hmm.
often use a lot of English terms and phrases, even when they're speaking in their native language. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it definitely raises some interesting questions about the role of language in shaping social dynamics and creating a sense of belonging or even exclusion. It makes you think, is this just a reflection of how globalized culture has become, or is there a more conscious effort to create an in-group, a way of signaling that you're part of this specific ideological tribe?
I think it's probably a combination of both, to be honest.
Yeah.
Language is such a powerful tool, not just for communicating ideas, but also for establishing identities, showing who you belong with, and even creating hierarchies.
Absolutely. We can't underestimate the power of language to both bring people together and divide them. It's a reminder that we need to be really mindful of how we use language, especially when we're talking about sensitive or complex issues. Because even small choices in the words we use can have a big impact on how our message is received and how we connect with each other.
This whole deep dive has really shown how even seemingly small things, like our word choices, can have these ripple effects on our relationships and on the broader social and political landscape. And it all started with a single Dutch podcast and the reflections of just two people. It just goes to show how powerful individual voices can be in starting bigger conversations and challenging the way we see the world.
It's been an incredible journey, hasn't it? From exploring the history of woke and how it connects to left wing politics, to looking at how this ideology is playing out in universities, personal relationships, and even the language we use. This deep dive has been a testament to the power of critical thinking, open dialogue, and being willing to question even our most deeply held beliefs.
I think the biggest takeaway for me, and hopefully for our listeners, is that there are no easy answers here. There's nuance and complexity to every issue, and it's our responsibility to engage with that complexity in a thoughtful and respectful way. It's about recognizing that progress takes ongoing effort, critical reflection, and a willingness to change our approach as we learn and grow. And most importantly, it's about remembering that we're all human, even when we disagree.
Perfectly said. And to all our listeners out there, we encourage you to keep exploring these ideas, to have these conversations with an open mind and a genuine curiosity, and to never be afraid to question your own assumptions, because that's what it means to be a true deep diver.